My name is Steve Rabe. I'm an historian. For 45 years, I was a university teacher, and I taught courses on U.S. foreign relations. Principally, I taught at the University of Texas at Dallas. Now, in terms of my research, I focused on U.S. foreign relations, and particularly on U.S. relations with Latin America. So quite obviously, I have to explain in this interview why I wrote a book on World War II. A couple other things I would like readers to know about me is that I've taught extensively abroad. I've taught in 20 different countries. It's been a privilege to teach in those countries. And I've taught for a full year at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And I've also taught for a full year at University College in Dublin, Ireland. And I've taught seminars on Argentina, Brazil, seminars in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador. I think this experience has given me an international perspective, something that I tried to bring to the lost paratroopers. One final thing that I'd like readers to know about me is that I'm a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. I served on active and reserve duty from 1970 to 76. In a nutshell, The Lost Paratroopers of Normandy, subtitle Resistance, Courage, and Solidarity in a French Village, is about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Ordinary people, paratroopers, and the people of the village of Graignes, Normandy, committed themselves to the ideals of freedom and liberty. The paratroopers and the people and the villagers upheld the ideals of the American and French Revolution. That's what. Now, in terms of what are the facts of what happened, these are the facts. On June 6, 1944, about 160 paratroopers landed near the village of Graignes. They were principally from the 82nd Airborne. They were hopelessly off target, and when they landed in a very swampy area that is normally flooded at this time of the year, but had been additionally flooded by the occupying German army. Unfortunately, a few paratroopers drowned during the landing on the morning of June 6, 1944. The commanding officer, faced with this problem, decided that the paratroopers would stay in the village of Graignes, which was a village of about 900 people, but that was not occupied by the Germans, though Germans were everywhere in the area. He decided that they couldn't get back to where they were supposed to be. They were about 20 miles off target. He said that they would defend the people of the village and wait for the invading forces from Omaha Beach to reach them. Now, in making this decision, the commanding officer was encouraged to do so by the villagers. They asked the paratroopers to stay in their village and defend them. In turn, they pledged their loyalty to the paratroopers. They went out into the swamps and retrieved all of the paratroopers' equipment, which included weapons such as mortars, machine guns, and they also retrieved their ammunition and medical supplies. They provided intelligence to the paratroopers, and they went out on reconnaissance missions to the paratroopers. There was 100% support for this aid to the paratroopers. Most important, the women of the village pledged to create a feeding campaign, and they provided 2 hot meals a day to the paratroopers. The women of the village cooked for 24 hours round the clock, and then they sent the children of the village out to the foxholes to deliver the food. Now, this plan of the commanding officer seemed to be working pretty well during the first days after D-Day. On June 9th, in fact, two infantrymen from Omaha Beach wandered into the village. So it seemed like the US infantrymen would reach the beleaguered paratroopers or isolated paratroopers, and the commanding officer's decision would work out. But there had been clashes with German forces around the area. The Germans eventually came to the conclusion there was a significant force in this village. More important, a division of SS troops, the 17th Waffen SS troops, was heading towards the village and would clash with the paratroopers on Sunday, June 11th. On Sunday, June 11th, first a German force in the area attacked the village. The paratroopers easily routed the invaders, inflicting significant casualties on the Germans. But in midday, Sunday, June 11th, and then in the evening of June 11th, the 17th Waffen-SS attacked the village. They outmanned and outgunned the paratroopers. The paratroopers were able to repel the initial attack, which was more of a probing attack. But in the second attack on Sunday, June 11th, they couldn't resist the attack. They were outmanned by about 5-1, and the Waffen-SS were bringing extremely heavy weapons to bear and bombarding the village. As such, the Waffen-SS overran the village. In addition, the paratroopers had run out of ammunition. Now, what then happened is that a large group of paratroopers made a relatively orderly retreat from the village. About 90 of them assembled and made a relatively orderly retreat. They, in terms of the retreat, and they eventually made it to the port town of Karatan, about 10 kilometers away, they were aided by the villagers. But the villagers also aided the remaining paratroopers by hiding them in their homes and in their barns, etc., for several days, keeping them safe from the Waffen-SS. Now, this is extremely important because when the Waffen-SS, the 17th Waffen-SS, entered the village, they practiced their so-called terror war. They executed all prisoners that they found. They executed all wounded prisoners, and they also executed some of the villagers, and in addition, threatened to kill all of them for aiding the US troops. The villagers of Graignes did not break. They did not provide any information to the Waffen-SS. Eventually, the Germans would burn the town to the ground. Now, ultimately about 110 paratroopers made it to safety to the port town of Karatan by June 16th, June 15th, June 16th. Thereafter, they went on to continue fighting in Normandy. They participated in the Battle of the Bulge. They participated in the jump over the Rhine River, and they also fought in the Rhineland area and freed literally thousands upon thousands of Eastern European slave workers. Now, for the villagers, the story was not over. They were forced out of their town by the end of June of 1944 and were in exile for 2 months. When they returned, their town was essentially burned to the ground by occupying German forces. Now, at all times, the people of Graignes never regretted what they did. They always referred to the paratroopers as our paras, or the liberators. And even 20 years after the fact, on an anniversary of June 6, 1944, the parish priest gave a sermon in which he drew an analogy between the paratroopers floating down to the village of Graignes and God the Father sending his only son, Jesus, to earth. So they, in fact, deified the paratroopers. Well, what I haven't revealed here, what is my evidence? My first part of evidence is, of course, I've known about this story for about 65 years because my father, Staff Sergeant René Emil Rabe, was a mortarman at Graignes and had told me about that he had been hidden for 3 days in a barn by a friendly French family. And he was one of 21 people that had been hidden in this French barn. And he told me that he was extremely hungry to the point of starving, and that he remembered that this friendly French family, farm family, came and cooked boiled cabbage with butter. And he would always say that this was the best meal that he'd ever had. Now, the question, so I had known about this story for 60 years, but my academic life had gotten in the way of writing about this. But I also knew about the story because I would accompany my father to reunions. And I would hear stories also about what had happened in the village of Graignes in the first week after D-Day of 1944. At the reunions, I met many of the children of the veterans. And of course, 60 years later, I renewed my relationship with the children when I decided to write about what had happened in the village of Graignes and start conducting research. So I had sort of singular access to participants in that I interviewed many of the children of the paratroopers who were most eager to talk about their father's experiences. Now, by the time I started my research a few years ago, all the paratroopers had passed. So essentially I had to rely on the memories of their children. But their children had all sorts of stories and interviews that their fathers had conducted. Their fathers had become local legends, had conducted interviews in local newspapers. And even their grandchildren were useful because their grandchildren perceived their grandfathers as heroes and had done school projects on their paratrooper grandfathers. And they even had done videos of them. So I could look at those school projects, and also I could also watch the videos. Now, also many of these paratroopers, their grandfathers and some of the children had actually gone to the village of Graignes and had met many of the local heroes and had gone to thank them. And so through that, I was able to make contact with the people in the village of Graignes, through the people who had already been there. And so I was able then to interview them and conduct interviews. I also then, like as an historian, conducted traditional historical research in the archives of the United States and in French documentary materials. Now, the most important thing is that the mayor of Graignes, Dennis Small, had collected all of the transmissions of the 17th Waffen-SS Division in terms of attacking the village of Graignes. I don't speak German, but my wife does. And she spent a year, a very long, hard, tedious year working on these transmissions because they were filled with military acronyms and were difficult to decipher, but gradually she was able to decipher them. She was also eventually able to figure out the code that the Waffen-SS was using when they report back to headquarters that they were carrying out war crimes, murdering and executing people. So go back to an original point that I had. I'm able, I think, to tell the story of what happened in the village of Graignes from June 6th to 16 June through three perspectives: through the American perspective, through the French perspective, and the perspective of the German invaders. The next one question is, why is my book different? And I think I would like to really emphasize this point. I think that it has both traditional and non-traditional aspects to it. If you are a buff of World War II history, if you're a person, a student of World War II history, I think and if you like military history, I think that you will like this book, because there's a great deal in terms of the paratroopers, in terms of their decision, why they decided to stay, as opposed to going back some 20 miles or trying to travel 20 miles on foot to their original designated landing spot. There is a great deal about the military skill of the paratroopers, because their fighting skill was quite evident in the attacks that first a German force and then the Waffen-SS launched, the three attacks that they launched on the village. The paratroopers displayed enormous military skill in inflicting very significant casualties on the Germans. The paratroopers lost about 50 of their men who were either killed in combat or were executed by the Germans, but they inflicted far, far more casualties upon the Germans. And then I think people who are World War II buffs would also like the fact that studying how they retreated and how they made an orderly retreat and how they made it back to the port town of Karatah. So I think there's a lot in here that people who are interested in traditional military history. In addition, I spend a good deal of time talking about the paratroopers themselves, who they were, what their background was, what their training was like, and also what happened to them in post-war America. And of course, many of these paratroopers were quite successful in post-war life. Two of them became mayors of their towns, those who had survived. On the other hand, I think that my book has non-traditional aspects in terms of emphasizing the role of civilians in the battle at Graignes. During the Normandy campaign, I think people seem to forget, or often forget, that over 20,000 Norman people died. Many of them died trying to assist the Allied forces in their struggle to liberate Normandy. And so I put a good deal of emphasis on the role of civilians. And these civilians include not just the men of the village, but also the woman and the children, all of whom played a role. The mayor of Graignes, Dennis Small, very proudly points out that while many French aided the Allies during World War II, and French aided the Allies during the Normandy campaign, that this is the only village where there was 100% support for the Allies. No one collaborated with the Germans. All of them stood steadfast. And so in terms of the sort of non-traditional aspects, I spend a good deal of time trying to probe why this village is so different. Why did everyone resist? So as I say, I think that my book has both traditional and non-traditional aspects, and I think it appeals to a wide variety. And so I also want people who don't normally read military history to look at this book and see that there are aspects that don't fall into the traditional basket of military history. Well, there are, I think, 2 or 3 kind of main reasons why I chose this topic. One is, I think, one could say that the Battle of Graignes is not a major event in the history of D-Day or in the history of the Normandy campaign. However, I think it is more important than most people realize. General Eisenhower declared that the Allies must liberate the port town of Paratroopers, which lies between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. And Paratroopers is about 10 kilometers north of the village of Graignes. Also, the German High Command decided that Paratroopers was important to capture or to recapture so as to split the invading forces at Omaha and Utah Beach. Now, the paratroopers at Graignes couldn't have known this, but their efforts and the efforts of the villagers delayed the 17th Division of the Waffen-SS for 2 days from attacking Paratroopers, that they delayed them. Ultimately, the paratroopers had to withdraw because they ran out of ammunition and were simply outnumbered by a factor of 5 to 1. They delayed the movement of the Waffen-SS by 2 days. As such, the Waffen-SS could only launch their attack on Paratroopers, which was their original and most important mission, on July 13th. By this time, the 101st Airborne had captured Paratroopers and had begun to reinforce the port town. By June 13th, tanks were arriving from the beaches to help reinforce the 101st Airborne. So the 17th Division was unable to accomplish its mission of capturing the port town of Paratroopers. And so I think that while I wouldn't argue that Graignes is a major military battle, I do think it has some strategic significance. But of course, what obviously brought me to this topic and why I was interested in doing this topic was certainly the personal nature of it, that my father was involved and the people I had met at a variety of reunions were involved in the Battle of Graignes. And of course, many of the people, as I said, went back to the village of Graignes. Many of the children, as well as the paratroopers, went back to the village of Graignes in later life in the 1990s at the turn of the century to thank the people. And of course, it is a kind of overwhelming experience to meet someone, as I did, who helped save your father. And you know, one person told me that when they met people who had helped save her father, she said, I just couldn't stop crying. Well, I was able to control my emotions, but it's an overwhelming experience to meet people who saved your father, who made your life possible, who made your daughter's life possible, and made your grandchildren's lives possible. It's an overwhelming experience. So clearly, in terms of doing this, there was the strong personal appeal beyond the fact that this is a very compelling and inspiring story. And it's a story, as the subtitle said, of resistance, courage, and solidarity. Something I hope that all readers will find compelling and inspiring. And then one final thing, there's a kind of coda to this. When the villagers went out into the swamps called the Marais to retrieve the paratroopers' equipment, one of the things that the women did was also retrieve the reserve parachutes. Now, the reserve parachutes were filled with parachutes made of silk. In the post-war period, the women of the village made communion dresses, confirmation dresses, and wedding dresses. And in the immediate post-war period, women of the village married, having often delayed because of the German occupation during World War II. And they wore dresses fashioned out of parachute silk to visibly demonstrate their commitment to what had happened during the first 2 weeks or the first 10 days after the D-Day invasion. So there was a whole variety of compelling reasons to write this book. Again, the underlying one, it's an inspiring and compelling story, and it tells something about people that have normally not made it into the history books in terms of the histories of D-Day and its aftermath. I think it's often forgotten that during World War II, when you combine the volunteer activities of women in both the United Kingdom and the United States, that approximately 1 million women were in uniform during World War II. And they were providing vital support services to the Allied forces. Queen Elizabeth II was in uniform during World War II. She was a lorry driver and a mechanic, and she's often said that this was one of her most important missions in life, having served during World War II. And she often felt she's quite proud of her service during World War II in uniform. So in order to defeat the Axis powers, the Allied powers needed everyone, and that included women. And over the last 10 to 20 years or so, both in books and in films, we have seen increasing attention paid to the role of women. Women were very involved in the code breaking at Bletchley Park, working with Alan Turing. Both the British and particularly the British sent female spies into occupied France at great peril to their lives, and many of them were caught and executed. But we have stories, for example, of Virginia Hall, who was an American, who is celebrated in the book, A Woman of No Importance, and about her spying activities in occupied France. So I think, what we see in terms of the French villagers, in terms of the women going these cooking campaigns and surreptitiously finding food, women of enormous courage. If any of them had been caught doing this, they would have been executed. And so whether it be the women who helped my father or the women who were cooking for the paratroopers, they were making a vital contribution to Allied victory, and they were doing so at enormous risk to their lives and to the lives of their families. And so I hope that the Lost Paratroopers of Normandy have made a contribution to the general movement that we need to include everyone in the history of World War II. And that includes women in uniform, women who are partisans, women who are surreptitiously helping the Allies, and also in some cases children, because one of the heroines of Graignes was 12 years old at the time, and fortunately still alive today at 90. And it's a woman who probably met my father personally and may have even escorted him to the barn. So I think that we need to include everybody in the history of World War II, and particularly in the history of D-Day.